Hello, you are listening to Talking Africa, the podcast from the Africa Report magazine that helps you deconstruct the news from the continent. My name is Nick Norbrook. You can block me on Twitter at Nick Norbrook. Don't forget to visit our website, theafricareport.com, where you can sign up for our 100% informative and 100% free daily newsletter to help you keep on top of things. I'm joined this week by our editor-in-chief, Patrick Smith, who recently sat down with Uganda's President, Yoweri Museveni. And we contrast that conversation with our recent interview with President Paul Kagame of Rwanda. Now, spoiler alert, we'll be doing a full takeaway on this relationship in the next print edition of the Africa Report, which hits the shelves at the end of June. Because it is a fascinating relationship, the one between Uganda and Rwanda, one which has soured greatly over the years. That is partly because after having worked as Museveni's spy chief, Kagame left to help found the Rwandan Patriotic Front, and partly due to a confrontation in the Congo between the two countries after they had banded together to oust President Mobutu. And they're now squaring off again. And again, the Congo looms large, but the impact spills across the whole of the East African community. First, though, we talk about the way in which Museveni has gone about managing the country's oil resources.
We asked him about why it's taken so long for Uganda to sort out its oil and gas. After all, in the region, Uganda was exploring for oil and gas quite some time before neighboring countries like Kenya and Tanzania were doing that. And the first oil finds in Lake Albert go back to the end of the last century. So this is, we're talking almost a 20-year process here. And he said, well, as far as he's concerned, the oil will always be there. It's always in the ground. It can stay there for 2 million years if necessary. What he wants out of it is to use it for national modernization. So he insisted all along that he would not accept a program to develop Uganda's oil resources which wasn't linked to building up local refining capacity. Well, that's fair enough as an abstract economic argument. But of course, in the world of oil business and profit and loss accounts, the companies were telling him, well, this just isn't practical. The age of these mini refineries has long gone. We have these big centralized refineries in the world. And that's what you do. You send your crude oil, it gets refined there and then sent back to you and packaged as petroleum products. And he said, I'm not interested in that. What I want is the refinery right next to the oil production. And then from there, we're going to produce the gasoline and the other petroleum products we need for our national market. And then we're going to export the surplus to the neighboring countries, and after that, the crude oil that's left over from that process, by all means, the big oil companies will have the rights to sell that overseas and make their money that way, and that's really the plan, and that's why it's taken 10 years of pretty tough negotiations with companies like Sinopec, China's Sinopec, and France's Total to get to the stage where they're going to start producing oil now, and they're going to start refining it at the same time.
It is quite extraordinary in a way to forego that, and it speaks to. I guess it speaks to the comfort in which he thinks he is domestically. He has managed to get rid of most opposition politics by one way or by another. What kind of track record does he have as someone who is structurally changing the economy of Uganda?
Well, the economy in many ways, particularly on the agricultural side, government has managed to zap up production, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years. And it's interesting you mentioned the politics, because I think there is a direct linkage there. One of the last big confrontations in Kampala between the opposition parties and Museveni's ruling National Resistance Movement was over fuel shortages and the price of fuel. So this strategy of refining oil locally and by that process providing fuel at a much cheaper cost to people, it seems designed also to solve that political problem, the shortage of food, as well as, shortage of fuel and the transportation of food around the country. So it's both a political and an economic process, if you like. And I think that's been the case with the agricultural policy. And in like so many of these, and I guess you would call Museveni's government a liberation party regime, because it came to power after fighting a civil war in the 1980s against the various military regimes, is that they start to lose popularity in the urban areas if they don't adapt to the changing demographics, but they maintain very strong popularity in the rural areas. So I think the political situation today is that his economic policies, particularly boosting the agrarian sector, remains very popular in many of the rural areas of the country. But his real political problems are in the bigger towns, where a younger demographic is saying, why has this guy been in power so long? And why is our economy not growing and changing at the pace at which we want to see it change? And I think that comes into the question of, how quickly is his program for modernization going to play out? And right now, I mean, the verdict around is that it has been delayed. This standoff with the oil companies has slowed down the economy. There's no doubt about it. He would argue, and as he did when we met him, that it's all worthwhile because he's going to have a much stronger, more locally based economy at the end of the process. But it's certainly a gamble.
Another leader who came to power in a liberation fashion is Paul Kagame. You could argue that there is a certain amount of swapping of political liberty for economic progress in Rwanda too. They are, joined by this particular history, both countries, with Kagame having served under Museveni in his own army of liberation all those decades ago. That relationship has really soured, has it not, in recent decades?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, Kagame and hundreds of thousands of Rwandans were refugees in Uganda in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and indeed. A big chunk of the ruling class in Rwanda today, the people around Kagame, his ministers, his generals, his brigadiers, and so on, they were refugees in Uganda. So the countries are really, really close. I mean, there's no question about that. They're part of that generation of Rwandans that fled the successive genocides in the 50s and in the 60s, or mini genocides compared to the terrible events in 1994 when over 800,000 people were killed. So there is that close historical tie. And indeed, Paul Kagame served in a very senior capacity in the military intelligence apparatus of Museveni's national resistance movement. And so there's no doubt that the two grew up with that very tight relationship. But it seems that after the genocide in '94 in Rwanda, and then Museveni and then Kagame subsequently coming to power, the two men have gradually distanced themselves from each other. There is that cliche, never outshine the master, put up by Machiavelli as one of the rules of power. And I think some people might say that Kagame seemed to be in danger of outshining Museveni. They had the similar approach to politics and economics, a combination of sort of nationalism and developmentalism, a strong state, concern with building a basis of local industrialization from the local resources available to them. And that initially seemed to work well as a kind of balancing factor between them. I think what really split them was the crisis in the Congo, and both countries intervened in Eastern Congo in the dying days of the Mobutu regime, and then entrenched themselves in Eastern Congo for, it has to be said, a range of economic and political imperatives, and then fell out. And there was 4 or 5 years after the fall of Mobutu, this big split between Rwandan forces and Ugandan forces in Kisangani. It was an armed confrontation, and that seems to have set in train this long animosity, almost 2 decades now, between Kagame and Museveni, and it's flared this year again. With Rwanda closing one of its main border posts, or 2 of its main border posts, with Uganda, and so that's where we are today. So you've got a real standoff between the historic leaders of Uganda and Rwanda.
Now we will be talking about these issues in the next issue of the Africa Report, so we don't want to give away all of our secret sauce, but it would be worth making some kind of comment on what that relationship in the Congo, and particularly as it refers to the Congo, how this relationship between Kagame and Museveni is evolving. Because we visited President Kagame in Kigali in late March, and obviously much of the talk was about the relationship, the fractious relationship with Uganda. But there was this interesting backdrop. There was the visit of the new Congolese president, Felix Tshisekedi, to Kigali, and it seemed that there was much going on in the background.
That's right. These 3 presidents, Tshisekedi of Congo, Kagame of Rwanda, Museveni of Uganda, are kind of locked in this drama. Their countries abut each other. They have a strong sense of national interest, and also a strong sense of when those national interests clash against each other. So I think what we're seeing now is that Museveni is like moving back and claiming this sort of elder statesman role. Kagame has been in power now in one way or another, has been in power for 25 years. Museveni's been in power for another 8 years on top of that. Tshisekedi is a new boy on the block, but I think Museveni is kind of asserting his rights of the eminence grise in the region. And he's playing what appears to be a pretty clever game. Rwanda has mounted its criticisms against Museveni, and he said, well, we'll sort those out, however. But he's also wooed Tshisekedi and said to Tshisekedi, well, the main problem is you face asserting yourself. You've got, you claim you've won an election. You claim that the previous president, Joseph Kabila, is on his way out. And don't forget that Kabila and Museveni were never very close. So Museveni is willing to work with Tshisekedi on spec. I think the relationship between Tshisekedi and Kagame is a fair